Hello and welcome back to the Land and Climate Podcast. My name is Alasdair McEwen, and for this episode I've been speaking to Mia Bennett, the co-author with Klaus Dodds of a new book, Unfrozen, The Fight for the Future of the Arctic. Mia is currently Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Washington and also a British Academy Visiting Fellow at the Centre for Outer Space Studies. Her book explores the new environmental, societal and political challenges posed by the fast warming and melting taking place in the polar region, an Arctic which has long been seen as having huge potential for geopolitical influence and extraction by the world's biggest powers. Now it looks like the frozen areas like the central Arctic Ocean could be free of ice in summer by the early 2030s, and the Arctic region and its many actors will then be confronted by many of the new opportunities or risks of this kind of rapid unfreezing.
The Arctic has been completely subjected to nuclear testing and experimental grounds for technologies of war, and that will only ramp up in the coming years.
I began our conversation by asking Mia to explain which countries and peoples made up the so-called Arctic region.
Today, the most conventional way that at least us as political geographers would define the Arctic would be any of the countries that hold territory north of the Arctic Circle, about 66 degrees north. Above that line of latitude, the sun does not rise in winter. So you have a very dark and cold region. There's 8 countries with territory north of the Arctic Circle. So that would be Russia, which has about half of the territory in the Arctic, largest Arctic state. Russia is the only non-NATO member in the Arctic. So now you have the 7 other countries, which are all NATO members, and those would be the US, Canada, Kingdom of Denmark, which includes Greenland and the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. So all of those countries we think of as, the main state actors in the region, but it's really important to equally recognize the power of Indigenous peoples and their organizations. So they're also powers to be contended with in the Arctic. Indigenous peoples have varying recognition and rights depending on the state in which they live. I would say the US and Canada have recognized the rights of Indigenous peoples and their rights to lands and resources the most. Nordic countries would be next, and then you have Russia. But there are groups that can be mentioned, such as the Sami Council, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and both of those groups also, it's worth noting that these Indigenous populations span national borders. So the power that Indigenous peoples exercise in the Arctic is often exercised in a way that they're trying to improve the status and position of groups in a much more border-spanning way. So I think that kind of work they do also makes us think about the Arctic as this much more truly circumpolar region. So that could lead us to thinking about the Arctic as a more ecological or cultural region that is not defined by territorial borders, but rather where cultures span, or where the taiga and tundra, where they kind of stretch across the region. So we can think about the Arctic in those more, let's say, organic ways as well as a region. And then you asked about newer powers, let's say, that might be interested in the North as well. I think often we hear about China as becoming a near-Arctic state, as it calls itself. So China has several icebreakers. They've had various expeditions carried out through the region for years now. They collaborate with Russia on gas extraction in the Arctic. They've built infrastructure in places like Norway. So China is definitely a force to be reckoned with. We have newer entrants like India, the United Arab Emirates as well. So a lot of countries from different parts of Asia in particular are really interested in the polar regions for resources, for science, perhaps for other sorts of political influence. So there's a myriad reasons why countries would be interested, but I think those are just a couple to highlight perhaps. And then, of course, you have longer-standing non-Arctic states that are interested, such as the United Kingdom, which likes to call itself the Arctic's nearest neighbor. So you could also see that longer history of polar exploration there as well.
Could you give us a mini history of the Arctic so that listeners can get a picture of the Arctic hasn't always been as it is now, and maybe just in terms of a kind of environmental and climate history of the Arctic?
The Arctic in its present frozen sense, we could date back to the end of the Ice Age. If you were to go back much longer, you would actually see the ice sheets have ebbed and flowed over 100,000-year cycles. But the Arctic as we know it, let's say, we can start with the Ice Age, which ended about 12,000 years ago. So that's when the ice sheets began their retreat to kind of, let's say, the present day extent where you have the Greenland ice sheet. Siberia is not covered in ice. You have some remnants in Canada with the end of the Ice Age. And prior to that as well, you started to have the peopling of the circumpolar north. So we end up with a region that has indigenous populations that eventually have the Inuit, for instance, moving out of northern Asia, ending up all the way in Greenland, by migrating via North America. You have populations going in the other direction out of Siberia, to which become the Sami later. So you have very much a peopled circumpolar north, one that has a lot of permafrost. That means the ground is frozen year round. And then you have ice sheets in places like Greenland and the Arctic Ocean, which is ice covered. And that is really where we're starting to see a lot of concerns that for the first time in a very, very long while, the Arctic Ocean may become ice-free in summer. So that would really be a dramatic state change from this Arctic that has been frozen for so long. So that's what people are really worried about with climate change, is that we are entering a new state in which the Arctic is unrecognizable from how it has been for all of human history.
It would be good to go now much more into that, which is, you do have a chapter in your book entitled Meltdown. Describe this meltdown in more detail, starting with the landscape and then the consequences for the inhabitants of the Arctic region and for animal life, living organisms, etc.
When we talk about Arctic climate change, it's worth stressing that the Arctic is indeed experiencing climate change at rates that far outpace what the rest of the world is going through. So scientists tend to estimate that the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the global average. A lot of that has to do with what's called the Arctic amplification effect. So when you have an Arctic Ocean that has been covered in sea ice for millennia, it's white, and that white ice reflects sunlight very well. As soon as that turns to blue open water, it's suddenly starting to absorb so much more heat than before. So that change in reflectivity, or albedo as it's called, is much more dramatic than, let's say, if you cut down a tree in the Amazon and that green tree turns to brown soil. The change is not as dramatic, so you don't have the amplification of heating going on that we see in the Arctic. So that's why the Arctic really it's melting, it's thawing, it's completely changing in many ways that were unforeseen. So what that means in reality is that you have an Arctic Ocean, as I mentioned, that could become ice-free for maybe 1 month or so by mid-century, if not before, which could open up opportunities for shipping, fishing, or even deep-sea mining. And fishing in the Arctic Ocean is currently banned, but you are seeing a lot of interest in what a more accessible Arctic Ocean might present. On land, we're seeing permafrost thaw, which runs the risk of not only kind of creating a very unstable foundation for a lot of the infrastructure built in the 20th century when that ground was much more reliably frozen, but also you run the risk of methane being suddenly emitted from all this organic matter that is defrosting, and carbon as well. So that's quite worrying. You might have seen headlines in the past few years of anthrax spores suddenly unleashed into the Arctic. So all that sort of stuff was awakening, as it were. So I would say the Arctic defrosts. Another phenomenon that is something that Arctic communities, wildlife have to deal with more and more every summer are wildfires. So these are really starting to blaze across the boreal forests, which encircles Siberia and Canada, parts of the Nordic countries every year, Alaska. And you have these huge smoky fires that are really combusting, and then not only kind of resulting in occasional evacuations even of entire Arctic communities, polluting the atmosphere and sending smoke and smog all the way as far south as New York and Ulaanbaatar. So quite worrying changes that seriously affects the Arctic and all of its inhabitants, but also have knock-on effects for global populations and climate as well.
Could we go into some details maybe about some of the parts of this, like the Arctic Ocean, for example, and maybe the kind of ecosystems in the Arctic Ocean?
So when we think about how species and wildlife are being affected in the Arctic, one phenomenon to start with is something called borealization. So you're starting to see species head north towards boreal latitudes, as it's called, in search of cooler climes, cooler temperatures. So you have a kind of odd phenomenon sometimes of grizzly bears even starting to wander north and occasionally mate with the odd polar bear, resulting in pizzlies that I think have been found once or twice in the tundra. So you have this strange mingling of animals coming up from the south, which results in people like Greenlandic fishermen catching species they've never caught. And sometimes this can prove to be a boon if suddenly there's a new lucrative fishery appearing in offshore waters. But other times, species that, let's say, these same Greenlandic fishermen could have relied on are no longer there because they're themselves going farther towards the North Pole. So you have a lot of ecological volatility and unpredictability. Killer whales, for instance, they're starting to maybe head more into the waters of bowhead whales. So you're starting to have perhaps more attacks. I mean, a lot of this is still very speculative. Some of the knowledge is based on Indigenous observations of change that they're perceiving. Scientists are also carrying out studies, but we're really seeing new species come north. I think oftentimes we think of Arctic ice as this very barren, unproductive landscape, if we even think of it as a sort of terrestrial form nearly. But that very ice has proven for millennia to be an incredibly rich habitat for all sorts of animals that rely on it as a hunting platform, like polar bears and seals and walruses, as a platform on which to give birth or simply to take a nap. That is no longer there. And then equally for all the little crustaceans and shellfish and algae underwater that cling to the ice. When that ice eventually tends to break up towards summertime, the ice then typically falls towards the seafloor, and that provides a kind of very bio-rich little source for other life in the sea column. But without that ice there, then you don't have this platform for all these little mollusks and stuff. So that's another worrying effect for ecology in the Arctic Ocean that we're seeing as a result of all this temperature change. One last thing I could point out is the ocean is also acidifying worldwide. And in the Arctic, that means you don't have, or in any of the world's oceans, there's no longer as much calcium for all the shellfish to create their shells. And for people in the Arctic who rely on crustaceans and shellfish as part of their diet, if you lose that crucial element, that is just yet another blow to people's traditional subsistence patterns. So we see it's all very much linked, all climate change and people's ways of life and just the health of ecosystems overall is very much in jeopardy.
And there's another chapter of your book, and well, there are a few chapters which talk more about the politics. And I wondered, with this meltdown that we've just talked about and the environmental climate effects, if we could now go just into the geopolitics and the breakdown, as you describe it, which is taking place. The other thing to say here is that there's been a relative peace and cooperative Arctic region in the last 40 years. And that, you suggest, and particularly since the Ukraine war, is breaking down and the governance there is breaking down.
During the Cold War, the region was very much one engaged in frozen conflict, as it were. So you had the two superpowers, the US and USSR, almost staring each other in the face via the Arctic. So both countries were building up nuclear arms, arsenals, pointing missiles at one another from various sites in the Arctic, building radar stations and to warn of early missile firings, things like that. Fortunately, there never obviously was a war, but there was a lot of tension. And what we're seeing now is that tension is absolutely ratcheting upwards again. And that draws a stark contrast with the past 30 odd years of much more positive circumpolar ties. A lot of that positivity can actually be traced to the Soviet Union and the desire by the last premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, who had this famous speech in Murmansk in 1987 where he called for making the Arctic a zone of peace. Now, one could question his motivations for wanting to turn the Arctic into a much more cooperative region. But there was some precedent. For instance, the 5 Arctic coastal states, so those would be the 5 states not only with territory north of the Arctic Circle, but also which have coastlines on the Arctic Ocean. In the 70s, they had agreed to cooperate on polar bear conservation. So there was a little bit of, let's say, a foundation to cement Arctic cooperation. Gorbachev called for this. Canada and Finland, as middle powers, were more up to the task of actually realizing this vision. The US bought into it as well. So as we go into the 90s, then we start to see a lot more work and interest by all of these Arctic powers, which no longer have to be so concerned with a military buildup, especially after the Soviet Union collapse. Instead, they can pour their energies into issues such as cleaning up radioactive waste, conservation of Arctic flora and fauna, search and rescue preparedness, Indigenous peoples issues, all of these, let's say, softer issues. And that work was formalized by the creation of the Arctic Council. So that's the leading intergovernmental body in which all of these 8 Arctic territorial states have membership, as do, quite crucially, 6 Indigenous peoples organizations. So it's a really unique intergovernmental body that has done a lot of incredible work to bring together the Arctic as a cohesive political and ecological region with shared management. All of that, Klaus and I argue, is very much standing on fragile ground as a result of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So weeks after that invasion, the Arctic Council paused its work. It has since then revived some forms of cooperation. So what are called the working groups, which they do the bread and butter of the Arctic Council's day-to-day cooperation. They have resumed their work virtually, but in the bigger scheme of things, Russia's full-scale invasion prompted Sweden and Finland to join NATO. So now you have this split in the Arctic of Russia versus the Arctic 7. And there's also been a huge amount of distrust towards Russia. So even if the war ends, I think this trust will not be able to be rebuilt, at least for a generation. And that really imperils the prospects for Arctic cooperation in the coming years and does a massive disservice to a lot of the achievements of the Arctic states and Indigenous peoples over the past 3 decades that in many ways is quite tragic, I feel. There's been so much good work, so much energy put into these efforts, and now we see that this really stands on shaky ground.
One of the other parts of your book talks about the environmental climate risks which exist as part of this geopolitical breakdown. Are we heading towards war?
I don't think we're heading towards war. I could share an anecdote about the book's title, which at first the publisher had suggested Unfrozen, the battle for the future of the Arctic. And Klaus and I were quite hesitant. We pushed back a bit against this title because we really don't want to presuppose armed conflict and suggest that it's inevitable in the Arctic. There's something special to it. We talk about this concept that others have discussed in the past called Arctic exceptionalism. This idea that the Arctic is such a unique region ecologically in terms of its history. It's had a lot of allure, for better or worse, for European powers, for empires, for colonial powers, for explorers to just come to this incredibly sublime and beautiful place, which they are the homelands of Indigenous peoples, but there's obviously been for centuries a lot of global interest in the region, which does account for why some cooperation can still persist in the Arctic, even despite the ongoing war in Ukraine. The Arctic Council stands on fragile ground, but there are other cooperative mechanisms, such as this fisheries agreement for the Central Arctic Ocean, which Russia and the other Arctic states are still meeting on every year. So cooperation does go on. So there's something special about the Arctic, which I would hope will serve as a further balm to prevent any kind of war. I do worry that what is happening is there's a massive amount of investment going on in militarization and building defensive infrastructure, which is drawing inertia away from all the work on climate and Indigenous peoples, which had persisted and thrived for the past 3 decades. Now, for instance, if you go to an Arctic conference, it's just security, security, security. So that's a signal that there's really little appetite for doing cooperative work. Nations in the Arctic and around the world are turning inward in a way that makes it seem that it's becoming a bit of a zero-sum game, a sort of interest in national security, energy, things like that is really, I think, outcompeting these much more collaborative relationships we saw form in more peaceful times. And that's my worry, is that we're going to lose a lot of the progress on environmental and human interest issues for the sake of militarization.
There is part of your book towards the end where you say we're heading towards a slow motion ecological disaster that is just getting underway.
I think that is really concerning when we think about the radioactive cleanup that was going on after the Cold War. So during the Cold War, the Soviet Union manufactured massive amounts of nuclear submarines, nuclear weapons, and then did not really maintain them very well. And especially once you had the 90s and this period of absolute chaos in what then became Russia, all this radioactive waste was left to rust in the open air. Fortunately, the international politics of the time allowed a lot of collaboration to come together to clean up a bunch of this waste with the help of the UK, Nordic countries, and other European states. All of that cooperation now, which did result in a good amount of cleanup, but now that's all been halted. Most likely we're not going to see cleanup of all of the stuff that remains in places like the Kara Sea, offshore Russia. Instead, I think what will happen is maybe there will be increased manufacture of nuclear arms, or at least placing of them in ways that may not be environmentally conscientious. So I think the risk of ecological disaster, whether nuclear or otherwise, is going upwards given the conditions of increased militarization and more distrust, less international monitoring. I think that presents a lot of worrying grounds, let's say, for ecological disaster. So yeah, whether it's slow motion or something happens really rapidly, we could point to an instance the other year of Russia for the first time allowing non-ice class vessels to transport oil via the Northern Sea route. So I think Russia is starting to take a lot more risks in its desire to continue building up its war chest to finance the war in Ukraine. So I think that also imperils the Arctic. That is perhaps what's more on my mind than the chance of a war breaking out the Arctic is this ecological disaster suddenly taking place, whether quickly or in slow motion.
You mentioned this potential restart in nuclear testing. So who's going to be doing that the most?
I don't want to issue any predictions on who will be doing the most nuclear testing. Trump has now and then said that he's interested in restarting nuclear tests. I'm not sure if Russia or China would do the same, but certainly once one country begins testing, perhaps it will set off a new arms race. I think that is worrisome. I mean, if we look to where nuclear arms have been tested historically, there's a place in the Russian Arctic called Novaya Zemlya. It's an island off the Russian northern coast, and that place had more nuclear tests than anywhere else on Earth except for Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan. So the Arctic has been completely subjected to nuclear testing and experimental grounds for technologies of war, and that will only ramp up in the coming years. I don't want to say specifically with nuclear testing, but it does run a chance of that. One other thing to just mention on that point is when I was speaking to someone in Norway, he mentioned that for the past 30 years, we thought that Russia would want to become a liberal democracy, would want to become like us. And we completely forgot that the world's largest single stash of nuclear weapons sits on the peninsula just a couple hundred kilometers from here. That presence of nuclear arms is very much on people's minds again, in the Nordic countries in particular, as they realize the risks, both military and ecological, of this setup effectively.
Okay, and I also wanted to mention part of your book, which refers to geoengineering. There is a bit where you suggest that as climate change progresses, there will be an increasing likelihood of geoengineering of some kind being used. And that also could create new conflicts that would be hard to control.
I absolutely see the likelihood of experiments increasing in both a global context and in the Arctic as the years march on and as progress towards the Paris Agreement falters. Right? So even in just the past year or so, I've seen a lot more discussion in Arctic forums, whether that's governance organizations or conferences on geoengineering. I think the topic is no longer taboo, but perhaps is becoming at least a more acceptable topic to even discuss in high-level forums. And that is inviting much needed discussion of how will we govern both these technologies and any experiments that might arise. There's a big potential for geopolitical misunderstanding of conflicts is because geoengineering interventions almost always span some sort of borders if they're large scale. And only a few countries would really be able to mount a potentially global climate altering intervention. And so you have a kind of built-in inequality, as with so many technologies, but particularly with geoengineering, in which some countries may be able to choose to deploy technology and everyone else may benefit or suffer, right? But it's very unknown. In years to come, hopefully there will be mechanisms that can be set up to establish a forum in which not only all the countries, but also Indigenous peoples can rightfully make their voice and their concerns heard over the consequences of geoengineering as these technologies evolve and are potentially applied.
I did want to talk about what you've experienced in the time that you've been actually looking at the Arctic.
One anecdote that just shows how much things have changed is in 2016, I was in sunny Los Angeles where I was doing my PhD. I boarded a direct flight to Moscow on Aeroflot from LA, which used to go every day or so. And I was wearing these huge -40 Canadian boots and a big fur coat from my dad from the 70s. And the woman next to me was this Russian grandmother, this babushka. And she was like, why are you wearing so many clothes? Moscow's not that cold in the winter. I'm like, oh, I'm actually going to Siberia. I'm going to Mirny City. So then she understood why I needed to wear clothes for sub 40 temps. So then I got to Moscow 12 hours later, and then I just quickly transferred to a flight on a diamond mining company's airline on which anyone could buy tickets to Mirny City. And within less than 24 hours, had gone from Los Angeles to the middle of Siberia to the world's largest open pit diamond mine. None of that travel would be possible now. Those interactions would be hard to have. That shows how Russia and the rest of the Arctic have now become really separated, which of course is terrible for political relations, but also just for kind of human ties. We're seeing a lot less communication, interaction, encounters, and those are the very kind of encounters that can help build this more circumpolar region. I had a fantastic time in Siberia in terms of just meeting people. This was in 2016, so I did meet in a bar one night a few people from Eastern Ukraine who had been displaced. So you're already starting to see in hindsight what we should have recognized as the start maybe of a bigger conflict that would cement and really fracture for the long-term relations between Russia and the West. But at the same time, I still was able to access these places and talk to people and see, I think, a whole world and a whole part of the Arctic that was really different. I mean, the Russian Arctic is incredibly urbanized. There's a huge amount of infrastructure that was built up under the Soviet Union. So that was really neat to see, because when you go somewhere like Alaska or Canada, there's far less infrastructure. There's not really nearly as extensive road and definitely not rail networks. So being able to contrast all of these different human landscapes in the Arctic was fascinating and eye-opening. And of course, I want to recognize that a lot of the infrastructure in the Russian Arctic was built by Gulag prisoners and built under incredible human duress and struggles and forced labor. So there's a lot of dark histories to the Arctic that I think are worth acknowledging. And the same goes for if you were to travel to places like northern Alaska or Canada, you hear tales of people who themselves might have still been in terrible residential schools, elder people. So we still see the imprint of colonialism in many communities in the Arctic. But also when you travel there, and I've heard stories from people, there's incredible amount of resilience. Cultural traditions still continue and thrive and are being revived in many places. So that's really exciting to see that Arctic peoples are embracing and celebrating their cultures. And that's something that I hope can still continue across borders, if it's possible, despite the fraught geopolitical times in which we live. So I find the Arctic, in short, is always an incredibly inspiring place, speaking to people who live in some of the harshest and most remote conditions on Earth. But they're always adapting. You can go there and they have the latest Starlink technologies or video games or snow machines, whatnot. So it challenges a lot of expectations. These are people who do not live in a snow globe and force you to look back on your own way of being and way of living. So I always appreciate that philosophical reflection I come back home with after every visit.
Overall, your book does seem slightly pessimistic about the future of the Arctic region, partly because so much dramatic change has already happened. Is there any possibility of reverse on this? And what can be done? For example, what states like the UK or even European states, given the huge impacts the meltdown in the Arctic will have on countries elsewhere, where should we be looking for action?
One case we highlight is the work of Indigenous leadership, oftentimes female Indigenous leadership. Just last week, was it, in the International Maritime Organization, which is the UN body that deals with global shipping, the Inuit Circumpolar Council became the first approved permanent consultant. They gained permanent consultative status, and they were the first Indigenous peoples organization to gain that status. So that means that the Inuit Circumpolar Council is not only a voice for Inuit in the Arctic at the IMO, but they're really modeling the work and the political power that an Indigenous peoples organization can hold on the global stage. Even if the Arctic is experiencing rapid climatic change, there's also interesting political organizing being done by Indigenous peoples that shows that other ways of global politics are possible that are not just purely state-based. I think that is an encouraging lesson that comes from the past 30 years of the really imaginative work done by various actors and polities in the Arctic to make that happen and to perhaps give inspiration to other parts of the world.
Thanks very much to Mia Bennett for her time. As usual, we have an exciting further reading list suggested by Mia, which you can find in our podcast blurb. And you can also find a link to Mia's book, Unfrozen, The Fight for the Future of the Arctic. Thanks also to Vasco Kostovsky for audio engineering the show, and I'll be back at the very beginning of the new year with a fresh interview. So, wishing you a very happy Christmas and winter break, and a happy new year when it comes. I'm Alasdair McEwen, and thanks for listening.